Hi, my name is Alea, and in this video, we're going to cover prokaryotic diversity. So, we're basically just going to kind of cover all the different prokaryotes that exist. And so, remember that the prokaryotes take up two domains of the tree of life. So, here's the tree of life, and the bacteria and the archaea, which are basically this giant branch and this giant branch in the tree of life. Those are all going to be our prokaryotes. And then remember that the eukaryotic cells are going to be found in the eukarya. That's why it's named that. But yeah, bacteria and archaea are both prokaryotics. We're basically just going to cover all the diversity that's going on over here. Obviously, I'm not going to go through everyone, just some of the more popular ones, clinically relevant ones, the ones that are most studied. Archaea, by the way, we don't have too much information on them. You'll see they really like to live in very extreme environments. So, they're a very niche group that there's not too much information on. Anyway, so let's start with the bacteria. So we're here in the tree of life. We're talking about the bacteria, and we're going to specifically talk about gram-negative bacteria. And so the proteobacteria are a phylum, so one main branch that are found in the bacteria group, and they are all going to be gram-negative bacteria. So gram-negative bacteria, remember, have a very distinct type of cell wall, and they have that outer membrane, so they've got that going for them. And we like to name the proteobacteria alpha, beta, gamma, so we're just using the Greek letters here. So the alpha proteobacteria, they're going to be these gram-negatives that live in very low nutrient environments. Often they are intracellular, meaning that they live inside of their host or whoever they're trying to infect. And so here is an example of a bacteria living inside of another cell. That's an example. Beta proteobacteria. These are another pretty big group of proteobacteria. So by the way, these are subcategories of the proteobacteria. Anyway, very diverse group, includes Neisseria, which one of them is Neisseria gonorrhea, so causes gonorrhea, and then Bordetella, one of them causes whooping cough. Okay, and then we've got the epsilon proteobacteria. These are going to be our low oxygen, curved, usually shaped bacteria. They're rods, curved rods, I guess. And this is going to include Helicobacter and Campylobacter. They usually have like flagella going on. They like to swim around. Helicobacter, by the way, is the one that causes stomach ulcers. So that just kind of gives you some perspective. So this is just kind of a sampling of some of the proteobacteria that exist on Earth that we know of. And again, I'm just kind of like giving you a sample. Okay. One of the proteobacteria that I want to talk about, or groups, is the gamma proteobacteria, and I have a separate slide on them because a lot of them are human pathogens, so I wanted to give them their own slide. So the gamma proteobacteria are a huge group. Again, these are all gram-negative bacteria. These are mainly going to be rods in the gamma proteome. Some really notable bacteria that are found here are going to be the Pseudomonas. So Pseudomonas are soil bacteria, but can also be pathogenic. And they also sometimes have these like fluorescent pigments. Vibrio is a bacteria that can cause disease like Vibrio cholera. Others are also bioluminescent. Legionella, this is a human one type of Legionella is a human pathogen that spreads through air conditioning. And then the enterics include E. coli and Salmonella, pretty famous microbes. By the way, the group of enterics means that these are bacteria that live typically in the gut. And so that's why we call them the enterics. And again, this is just a sampling of some of the gamma proteobacteria. And by the way, whenever I have like SPP with a dot, that means species. So I'm talking about Pseudomonas as a genus, and then there's like multiple Pseudomonas. So there's like Pseudomonas putida, and then there's like Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So I'm just kind of grouping them into one and giving you a general overview of that genus or that group, whatever you want to call it. Okay. Then there's other gram negatives. So there's the chlamydia. That one's kind of its own group because it's really weird. Chlamydia spreads through sexual transmission. It is a intracellular pathogen, meaning that it has to live inside of the host. and has a very unique life cycle, which I'm not really going to go over, but yeah, it's got an interesting life cycle. The spirochetes, these are like super spirally shaped bacteria, which includes Treponema, which one of the species of Treponema causes syphilis. And there's a picture of the spirochete. As you can see, it like has this like super twisted kind of shape to them. And this axial filament, this axial filament is actually like a modified flagella that wraps around the cell to give it that spiral shape. Okay, anyway, and then the Bacteroides. This is a huge group, by the way. Bacteroides is not just one type of microbe. That's another gigantic category of gram-negative bacteria, and they are a lot of, this includes a lot of the common gut microbes. So as you can see, I'm just kind of giving you some sampling of the different microbes that are out there. Then we have the photosynthetic bacteria. So again, going back to the tree of life, we're going to be looking at the photosynthetic ones. And so here and there, we're going to be talking about them. So first of all, there's two types of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis that produces oxygen and photosynthesis that does not produce oxygen. A lot of people think photosynthesis only produces oxygen. That is the case for plants, obviously. But there are some bacteria that do photosynthesis that does not produce oxygen, so we call them the non-oxygenic photosynthetic bacteria. And they have funny names, so we call them the green sulfur bacteria because they're green, the bacteria are green, and they produce sulfur during their photosynthesis. Then we have the green non-sulfur bacteria. These are still green, they are still photosynthetic, but they don't produce sulfur, they produce something else. So they don't produce oxygen, and they don't produce sulfur, it's something else that they produce. And so that's why we call them that. And then we have the purple sulfur bacteria. So they're purple, and they produce sulfur during their photosynthesis. And guess what? The purple non-sulfur, so they're purple, they do photosynthesis, but they don't produce sulfur. They also don't produce oxygen. Anyway, so those are the categories. And then finally, there is some bacteria that do oxygenic photosynthesis, meaning that it does produce oxygen. And really the main one is going to be our cyanobacteria. So there they are. And they are going to be using the exact same photosynthesis process as plants. So they use the same chlorophyll, they're green, just like a plant. So yeah, that is our groups of photosynthetic bacteria. All right, so that was all the gram negatives. Now let's move on to the gram positive bacteria. So we've got a bunch, and I don't even want to go over all of it because there's just so many. And honestly, the grouping for the gram positives is really screwed up. So yeah, anyway, so there's like Mycobacterium, which we learned before is a acid-fast positive bacteria. We've got Corynebacteria, Clostridium, Streptococcus, Bacillus. I didn't even put Staphylococcus here, but Staphylococcus is also part of this grouping. There is a lot of bacteria in the gram positives. But like I said, the way that they've categorized them is really confusing, so we're not really going to go over it too much. Okay, but in general, most of the gram positives are going to be named based on their appearance. So notice we say coccus if it's a coccus, bacillus if it's a bacillus, right? Strep, meaning that they're in like a, a chain. If it was staphylococcus, that means that they're clustered like grapes. So, yeah. Okay, and then finally, we've got the archaea. Like I said, we don't really have too much information on the archaea because they like to live in very extreme environments, so it's kind of hard to study them. There are some archaea that live in normal places, though. So, normal soil, in the human body, etc. They're just hanging out. But when people think of archaea, we usually think of the extreme archaea because they live in, super high temperature or high pressure, high salt environments. That's kind of what people associate archaea with. It's not like there aren't archaea that live in normal conditions. It's just when we think of archaea, we like to think of the extremes. So there's some categories. Crenarchaeota, That's a cool name. These are usually aquatic. They like to live in high temperature. So hyper means high thermo temperature, and phile means to love. So they're hyperthermophiles. That's cool. We've got the Euryarchaeota, which includes your methanogens and halophiles. So these are going to be the guys that produce methane. So the methanogens are fun. They are these microbes that produce methane. A lot of them are found in cows, for example, like the guts of cows. So when cows fart, they produce methane. That's one example of a methanogen. Halophiles, these are going to be bacteria that live in very high salt environments. So here's a picture of a very salty lake, and it's pink because the archaea are actually pink when they grow. And so, yeah. All right, that was my video on the diversity of prokaryotes. Obviously, I was just kind of picking and choosing some categories. I could go on and on about the different types of microbes. So hopefully this video was fun, and I will see you in the next video.